In part 3, we refill the final drive and do a very thorough service of the rear brake, completing a brake fluid purge of the ABS pump with the GS911 next. A small description of tires and finishing up the reinstall of the muffler gets us to the engine work next. Okay, I removed the O-ring from the fill plug and the copper crush washer from, this is the drain plug with the O-ring, and the fill plug has the copper crush washer. I have a complete supply of copper crush rings for final drives, for underneath the cam tensioners, the engine oil drain plugs for wet heads, the fill seal where the oil fill cap goes. There are O-rings for regular cam heads and hex heads. It's just a single point location that I carry all these crush washers with me. So now we've got new ones laid out here, and we're going to put them on to install new. Obviously you put the fill in the drain plug first so that we don't just run it off onto the ground. This is a T45. I may have said it incorrectly when I took it out, but this is a T45 for the drain plug, not a T40. Okay, I've got the fill line marked at 180. I go slightly over because a certain amount of the oil sticks to the inside of the bottle and doesn't actually go inside the final drive. These are normal hair coloring. You can buy them from Sally Beauty Supply or a lot of different beauty salons. It's just a simple angled tip applicator for hair color for, I don't know, ladies or men. You probably can't see from this angle, but right inside the opening for the fill hole is the notches for the speed ring and the edge of the big gear inside the final drive. So this doesn't go in very far, and it certainly doesn't go in very fast. So if you just tip it up and let it kind of go in gradually with just small squeezes, because it has to run between a very small space, the end of the applicator and the big gear to go down inside here. If you squeeze it too hard, it'll just come right back out the hole, and then you won't know how much you put in your final drive. Now we need to run the speed sensor ring in through here and feed it back into its hole. And the torque setting on it is 5 Newton meters. Okay, so the last thing we need to do that's final drive work and not brake work or anything else is I need to put some Loctite on the threads on this thing. So while I'm going to work on that with 2 hands, I'm just going to stick a shaft straight through here to support that so it doesn't just fall down. We'll put a little bit of the Loctite on here. That's plenty. And now we'll lift this up and replace the keeper shaft.
When we were working on the drive shaft, and if you have corrosion and water or rust, anything inside the paralever tunnel, and you need to work on the forward accordion boot where the paralever meets the transmission, you disengage the accordion boot from the paralever side first. It has the clips on it, and there's a zip tie that goes around the front. It looks like it's a standard zip tie, but it's not one that you can use readily available from every supply store that has zip ties. you need this specific part number. It's a narrow zip tie, and it only is the right diameter, right thickness to fit into the groove to attach to the transmission itself. So if you do have to pull the drive shaft out, you can get the accordion completely, this forward accordion boot out. But when you reinstall it, you need this correct zip tie. It's a little longer than a standard zip tie, and it's very narrow to fit around properly. So after you assemble the final drive and you torque the paralever support arm, it's time to complete putting the brake caliper back on. And so while it's off is a good time to service the brake pads and to clean the area around the slider block. And so I'm going to just mount it on here loosely at this point and remove the 2 cotter pins that hold the keeper pin on. So as we remove the cotter pins, you pull out the keeper, and it's got a lot of spring pressure from this top tensioner, the anti-rattle springs, and so the pads can fall right out. So pull them out, and we're going to clean the pads themselves because they get completely embedded. The wear indicators, as seen from the edge, these tell you when the pads have worn to minimum serviceable depth, but they get filled, as you can see here on this one right here on the very tip. This is full of debris, and this acts like lapping compound on your brake rotor when road film, sand, and debris get in these cracks, as well as the debris and road film that gets into the holes in the rotor. They all act as abrasives against the rotor and the pad and causes much more rapid wear on these components. So as you pull out the pads, it's easy to look up underneath here and you see the contact points where the front of the pads, the thrust bearing surface of the pad itself, pushes on the inside of the caliper. So we need to clean this contact surface, and it's a little bit of a sliding surface as the caliper works back and forth. But the real sliding, floating part, the rear brakes are a fixed rotor and a sliding caliper, a floating caliper. The front brakes are just the opposite. They are fixed calipers and floating rotors. So the caliper in the back has this floating mechanism that we need to pull out and lubricate the pins, clean the pins. So the dust boots go on some annular rings that are inside, and as we pull this apart, we have to clean and lube the 2 pins that allow the caliper to float on the bracket as the bracket is bolted firmly to the final drive. Okay, so once the sliding bracket, the bracket is fixed onto the final drive, you just clean off all of the pin on it and the pin on the back side of the actual caliper itself. Just clean off the old residue of any grease that's there. Since one of them slides into a pocket on the other ones, just clean out the inside a little bit. On each side has a receiving socket and a pin. So it's time to put some new grease on the pins and in the holes. Before I put these back together, this is the thrust area where the brake pads actually do all of the work, and so clean them all off completely. And I like to put a little copper slip on this area so that it's a real high pressure kind of a grease, just a tiny little bit. I'll spread that around with a Q-tip so that the end of the brake pad has a very high temperature, high pressure lubricant on it so that it'll move freely. So when we put this back together, the pins have to mate at the same time. They go back together. The boot snaps into the annular ring that's on the shaft. As you pull them out, you ensure that the boot is engaged into the ring. It's following the movement of the floating part of the caliper. Wipe off any extra grease that got wiped off during the insertion process. And now you can put your caliper back on, and we'll service the pads. We'll work on the pads and clean them up before we install them inside the mounted caliper. So after we have the caliper loosely placed up here, it's time to clean the brake pads themselves. And like I said, you can see there's a lot of debris that's filled into these cracks that we have to get all this out of here. Otherwise, we continue to machine the rotors to scratch and make grooves in them and wear the brake pads. So just pick through this edge to get out all the debris that's in there, embedded in there firmly, and then I use a stainless steel wire brush to clean off the edges because they get sand embedded in them. So these get sprayed off, get cleaned. The rotor itself of any oils from handling when we were moving the drive shaft around. So now it's time to mount the caliper firmly. It's easier to put in the pads while everything is actually firmly mounted up here. So this takes just a drop of blue Loctite on each one of these. Okay, so the final setting is 24 Newton meters. All right, so now you can see without having pads in here, you can see the way that the caliper floats freely on those pins. Should have absolutely no friction, so that even just the slightest variation of the rotor is what pushes the caliper and the pads back from contact. So now we'll put a little copper slip on the tips of the pads where the contact surface is. Just a small amount, doesn't take very much. You don't want to have it leak by and get to the rotor or the pad surface at any time. So, all right, that's enough. These can only go in one direction, so obviously this would be for the inner one, and it just slides along the rotor, and you can look from the inside and see a little shelf where the front goes, and you kind of hold it in place, and the other one slides in. You push the caliper, give yourself a little room, and it slides in, and they both sit on the front part that you just put the copper slip, sits in that little channel on the front of the caliper. So you hold them tight and get your pin. Each one of these has to be pushed up against the spring, the anti-rattle spring, and the pin goes right through. Put in both safety clips, and the job is complete. So now it's time to complete the servicing of the brakes. We're going to bleed the brakes, and we're going to use the GS911 module to actually purge the anti-skid control valve, electronically opening the solenoids, running the pump motor inside the ABS brake pump, and it purges all the fluid from inside the chambers of the ABS pump. So we need to clean off all the area around the brake reservoirs before we open them up. So if you're not going to do a complete purge of your systems, because it requires the brakes only to be completely bled every 2 years, you can test the moisture content inside your brake fluid reservoirs by purchasing a little tool like this that can read the water content across the conductivity across these two probes. So as you put it in and it touches into the fluid, it reads how much moisture is in the brake fluid, and this one is between 0 and 1. It just barely flickers the 1% of moisture, and it's well into the OK or 0% for the fluid being no moisture in it at all. So this is in great shape. So I would like, when you normally do a complete brake purge, you draw out all the fluid from the reservoir, then you push the pistons back into the caliper and displace all of the fluid possible from the inside of the caliper chambers back up into the reservoir again, draw out all the fluid. So in essence, there's no fluid in the caliper pockets. The pistons have pushed back all of the fluid out of the cylinders of the calipers. And then you start to add new fluid and put fluid through the lines, and they go into the caliper piston area. The cylinders and pistons have zero space left, so you get all new fluid into the calipers when you start to purge out the fluid. So as soon as you complete the normal brake bleeding process, the mechanical functions of purging the fluid out of the calipers, refreshing fluid in the reservoirs front and rear, it's time to do the ABS pump purging using the GS911 module. So once you have it connected to the motorcycle and the software is on here, the first thing it wants to do is have an interface, turn on the ignition on the motorcycle, and it can start having full control of everything on the bike. Okay, so once we get into the components, we're going to check the controller is the brake controller. We're going to do the service functions. We're going to, here's service functions again, another choice. And we're going to go up here and we have X ABS function, and it's ABS pump. And we want to bleed the brakes, the second pull down menu option here. So now we select run the function. Activate the brake 3 times for 2 seconds each, and then release. Now it says you can now perform another bleeding process according to the repair instructions. Tighten the bleed screw. We have the bleeder bag on, and we're going to just crack the speed bleeder. And I have the hose run uphill so that you can see the fluid coming up. So we just pump, and there were some bubbles that came out. And since it's just the purge, we just are going to tighten this up snugly again. And I'm going to do the rear caliper the same time. Just crack it open and pump the rear brake. Tighten it up. Follow the GS911 module again. Then switch the ignition off. And switch the ignition on. The function was complete. It just depends upon how the module runs. It said in the first instructions it was going to require 2 bleeds. So after the ignition is back on, it's completed all of the sequences of purging the ABS pump. So now we've done a mechanical bleeding of the brakes. The front circuit all splits from one, so you only have to do the ABS pump purge from one side. It doesn't matter which side. And the rear circuit is on another part of the ABS cycle. So now we've purged, done a mechanical bleed and an ABS purge on both front and rear circuits, and the brake bleeding is complete. It's time to, we're finished with everything in the back. We've serviced the final drive and the brake system, and it's time to reassemble all the rest and put the wheel back on and put the muffler back on. And we'll tidy up all the mechanical parts of the suspension of the service of the bike, and then we'll go on to working on the engine.